The autumn rain drummed against the windows of Clarence's house as King Charles III sat in his private study, staring at the unopened letter on his mahogany desk. The royal seal bore William's handwriting, but something about the way his eldest son had delivered it personally that morning, without a word, suggested this was no ordinary correspondence. Charles had noticed the growing distance between himself and William over the past months. What had once been warm father-son conversations had become stilted, formal exchanges befitting their royal roles, but lacking any personal connection. The king couldn't pinpoint exactly when things had changed, but he suspected it coincided with certain changes in the household dynamics since his coronation. Camilla entered the study quietly, carrying a tea service on a silver tray. Her movements were careful, measured, as they had been lately whenever William's name came up in conversation. She set the tray down and glanced at the letter, her expression flickering for just a moment before she composed herself. "Is that from William?" she asked, her voice carrying a note of concern that Charles might have missed if he hadn't been watching her so carefully. "Yes," Charles replied, reaching for the letter. He seemed rather serious when he brought it this morning. "Barely spoke to either of us." Camilla busied herself with pouring the tea, but Charles noticed the slight tremor in her hands. "Perhaps it's about the children's schedules," she suggested. "George has been quite busy with his studies, and Charlotte has those writing lessons coming up." Charles knew his wife well enough to recognize when she was deflecting. After years of marriage, he could read the subtle signs of her discomfort. The way she avoided direct eye contact when she was worried, how she would find small tasks to keep her hands busy when her mind was racing. He broke the wax seal and unfolded the heavy paper. William's handwriting was neat and controlled, but Charles could sense the emotion behind the carefully chosen words. "Father, I find myself in the difficult position of needing to address matters that have been troubling me for some time. Recent events have made it impossible for me to remain silent about certain concerns regarding our family's well-being and the influences that may be affecting our relationships. I believe we need to have a conversation privately about the future of our family and the responsibilities we all share. There are things that have come to my attention that require your immediate consideration. I would prefer to discuss these matters in person, away from the usual formalities and interruptions. Perhaps we could meet at Highgrove this weekend, just the two of us. Your son." William Charles read the letter twice, his concern growing with each word. The formal tone was unlike William, who usually addressed him with warmth and familiarity, even in written correspondence. The phrase, "influences that may be affecting our relationships," struck him as particularly pointed. "What does he say?" Camilla asked, settling into the chair across from his desk with her teacup balanced delicately in her hands. Charles looked up at his wife, studying her face carefully. "He wants to meet privately at Highgrove this weekend. Says there are family matters he needs to discuss with me." The color drained slightly from Camilla's face, and she set her teacup down with a soft clink. "Family matters? What sort of family matters?" "He doesn't specify," Charles replied, folding the letter and setting it aside. "But he seems quite serious about it." "Camilla, is there something I should know? You've seemed rather on edge lately, particularly when William's around." Camilla stood abruptly and walked to the window, her back to Charles. Outside, the garden was gray and dripping, reflecting the somber mood that had settled over the room. "I'm sure it's nothing serious," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "You know how William can be. He takes his responsibilities very seriously, perhaps too seriously sometimes." Charles rose from his chair and approached his wife. He could see her reflection in the window, and the worry lines around her eyes were more pronounced than usual. "Camilla, we've been married long enough for me to know when something is troubling you. If William has concerns, I need to understand what they are." She turned to face him, and for a moment, Charles saw something in her eyes that he couldn't quite identify. Fear? Guilt? Before he could analyze it further, she smiled and placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Perhaps it's about the workload," she suggested. "William has been taking on more responsibilities lately, And with Catherine managing her own royal duties while caring for the children, they might be feeling overwhelmed. Maybe he just wants to discuss redistributing some of the engagements. Charles nodded, but he wasn't entirely convinced. William had never shied away from his duties, and if anything, he had been eager to take on more responsibilities as he prepared for his future role. The tone of the letter suggested something more personal, more urgent. That evening, Charles found himself unable to concentrate on his usual evening reading. He kept thinking about William's letter and Camilla's reaction to it. His son had always been direct in their communications, but this letter felt different. There was an undercurrent of disappointment, even anger, that Charles couldn't ignore. He thought back over the past few months, trying to identify any incidents that might have caused tension. There had been the usual media speculation about royal family dynamics, particularly around major events and public appearances. Camilla had been receiving more prominent roles in ceremonial functions, which had been met with mixed public reaction. Some traditionalists still questioned her position, while others had come to accept her as an integral part of the royal family. Charles remembered a particular incident from a few weeks ago during a family gathering at Balmoral. William had arrived with Catherine and the children for what was supposed to be a relaxed weekend. However, Charles recalled that William had seemed distant, particularly during meals when the conversation turned to future plans and ceremonial duties. There had been a moment when Camilla had made a suggestion about the children's involvement in upcoming state occasions. William's response had been polite but firm, indicating that he and Catherine would make those decisions independently. At the time, Charles had thought nothing of it, attributing William's response to his protective instincts as a father. Now, he wondered if there had been more to it. Camilla entered their bedroom as Charles was getting ready for bed. She moved about their evening routine quietly, but Charles could sense her preoccupation. Finally, he decided to address the elephant in the room directly. "Camilla, I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me," he said, sitting on the edge of their bed. "Has something happened between you and William? Something that would explain why he wants to meet with me privately?" Camilla paused in brushing her hair, meeting his eyes in the mirror of her dressing table. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Charles could see the internal struggle playing out on her face, the careful consideration of how much to reveal. "William is very protective of his family," she said finally, choosing her words carefully. "He's always been sensitive about maintaining boundaries, especially when it comes to the children and their upbringing." "That's not really an answer to my question," Charles pressed gently, but firmly. "Has there been a disagreement? A misunderstanding, perhaps?" Camilla set down her brush and turned to face him fully. "Charles, you know how complex family dynamics can be, particularly in our situation. Sometimes people perceive things differently than they're intended." Charles felt a growing sense of unease. His wife's carefully diplomatic language was so unlike her usual straightforward manner. "What kind of perceptions?" "Camilla, if there's been a problem, I need to know about it. William is my son, and maintaining our family relationships is crucial, both personally and for the monarchy. I'm sure whatever concerns William has, you'll be able to address them when you meet," Camilla said, effectively closing down the conversation. "He's always been reasonable when things are explained properly." That night, Charles lay awake long after Camilla had fallen asleep beside him. The conversation had only deepened his concerns rather than alleviating them. His wife's reluctance to discuss William's letter directly suggested that she knew more about his son's concerns than she was willing to admit. Charles thought about his relationship with William throughout the years. From the early days when Diana was still alive and they were navigating the complexities of royal parenthood, through the difficult period after Diana's death when both boys had struggled with grief and public attention, to the present day when William had grown into a capable and devoted father himself. The relationship between Camilla and his sons had always been delicate. Both William and Harry had eventually come to accept their father's second marriage, but it had taken time and patience from everyone involved. Charles had always been grateful for William's mature approach to the situation, his willingness to put family unity above personal feelings for the sake of the monarchy and their shared future responsibilities. The next morning brought no clarity, only more questions. Charles noticed that Camilla was unusually quiet during breakfast, barely touching her food and responding to his comments with distracted nods. When he mentioned that he planned to call William to confirm their weekend meeting, she suddenly became more animated. "Perhaps you should wait until you've had more time to think about what you want to discuss with him," she suggested. "You don't want to seem too eager or concerned. It might make whatever issues he has seem more significant than they actually are." Charles found this advice puzzling. In his experience, addressing concerns promptly and directly was usually the best approach, particularly in family matters. Delaying could often make situations worse, allowing misunderstandings to fester and grow. "I think William would appreciate knowing that I take his concerns seriously," Charles replied. "Whatever is troubling him, I want to address it as soon as possible." Camilla nodded, but Charles could see that his response didn't please her. She excused herself from breakfast early, citing a headache, leaving Charles alone with his thoughts and his growing conviction that this weekend's meeting with William would reveal more than just his son's concerns about royal duties. As Charles prepared for his day of meetings and official functions, he made a mental note to pay closer attention to the family dynamics he might have been overlooking. If William felt strongly enough about something to request a private meeting, it was clearly more serious than routine administrative matters. The thought that there might be tension in his family that he had failed to recognize troubled Charles deeply. He had worked so hard to maintain strong relationships with his sons, particularly after the challenges they had all faced during his marriage to Diana and the aftermath of her death. The idea that something was now threatening that carefully rebuilt harmony filled him with a sense of dread that no amount of royal training had prepared him to handle. By the time Friday arrived, Charles found himself both anticipating and dreading his meeting with William. He had spent the week observing Camilla more carefully, noting her continued nervousness whenever William's name came up in conversation. She had even suggested that perhaps she should accompany Charles to Highgrove, a suggestion he had politely but firmly declined. As Charles prepared to leave for Highgrove, Camilla approached him with what appeared to be a prepared speech. "Charles, whatever William wants to discuss, remember that families sometimes have misunderstandings. Things can be taken out of context, or people can misinterpret good intentions." The fact that she was essentially coaching him on how to handle the conversation with his son struck Charles as highly unusual and somewhat inappropriate. It reinforced his growing suspicion that Camilla knew exactly what William wanted to discuss and was concerned about how those discussions might unfold. "I'm sure William and I will be able to work through whatever concerns he has," Charles replied diplomatically. "We always have in the past." As his car pulled away from Clarence's house, Charles caught a glimpse of Camilla watching from an upstairs window. Her expression was unreadable, but something about her posture suggested a person bracing for impact. Charles realized that by the end of this weekend, he would likely understand not only what was troubling William, but also why his wife had been so anxious about this meeting taking place. The drive to Highgrove gave Charles time to prepare himself mentally for what might be a difficult conversation. He had learned over the years that his role as both father and king sometimes required him to hear truths that were uncomfortable but necessary. As the countryside rolled past his window, Charles steeled himself for whatever revelations awaited him in his upcoming conversation with his eldest son. The gravel crunched under the wheels of Charles's car as he arrived at Highgrove House on Saturday morning. The Georgian manor stood bathed in pale autumn sunlight, its honey-colored stone walls and perfectly manicured gardens offering a sense of peace that Charles hoped would extend to his upcoming conversation with William. This place had always been his sanctuary, where royal protocols could be set aside for genuine family moments. William's car was already parked in the circular driveway, and Charles could see his son's familiar figure standing near the entrance, hands clasped behind his back in a posture that Charles recognized from his own father. Even from a distance, Charles could sense the tension in William's bearing. As Charles approached, William stepped forward with a formal nod. "Father," he said simply, his voice carefully controlled. "William," Charles replied, extending his hand and then, thinking better of it, instead embracing his son briefly. He felt William's body remain rigid during the embrace, confirming his suspicions that this would not be an easy conversation. They walked into the house together, the familiar sense of lavender and beeswax greeting them in the entrance hall. Charles had deliberately arranged for minimal staff to be present, wanting to ensure their privacy. He led William to his favorite sitting room, where a fire crackled in the hearth, and comfortable armchairs were positioned to encourage intimate conversation rather than formal discourse. "Can I offer you anything?" "Yeah, coffee," Charles asked, falling back on the social niceties that seemed particularly important in moments of uncertainty. "Nothing, thank you," William replied, taking a seat across from his father. His posture remained formal, and Charles noticed that his son's jaw was set in a way that reminded him painfully of Diana when she was preparing to address a serious matter. Charles settled into his own chair and studied his son's face. William had inherited Diana's expressive eyes, and right now they held a mixture of determination and what appeared to be disappointment. The silence stretched between them until Charles finally broke it. "Your letter suggested there were family matters you wanted to discuss. I'm here to listen, son." William took a deep breath, and Charles could see him organizing his thoughts. "Father, what I'm about to tell you may be difficult to hear, but I believe you need to know what's been happening within our family circle. It concerns Camilla and her interactions with Catherine and the children." Charles felt his heart skip slightly. "Go on." Over the past several months, there have been a series of incidents that, individually, might seem minor, but taken together paint a troubling picture. William's voice was steady but carried an undercurrent of controlled anger. "Camilla has been making decisions and suggestions regarding my family that go well beyond appropriate boundaries." "What kind of decisions?" Charles asked, though he was beginning to understand why Camilla had been so nervous about this meeting. William leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped tightly together. "It started with small things. Comments about the children's education, suggestions about their public appearances, opinions about how Catherine and I were handling their upbringing. At first, Catherine and I attributed it to good intentions, perhaps an eagerness to be helpful as a step-grandmother." Charles nodded, encouraging William to continue while his mind raced through recent interactions, looking for signs he might have missed. "But then it escalated," William continued. "3 weeks ago, Camilla called Catherine directly to inform her that she had arranged a photo session for George and Charlotte with a particular photographer, one known for rather staged artificial portraits. She hadn't consulted us first, simply assumed we would comply with her arrangements." Charles felt a surge of surprise and concern. "That seems highly inappropriate. What did Catherine say?" Catherine politely but firmly declined and explained that we prefer to handle such arrangements ourselves. Camilla's response was to suggest that Catherine didn't understand the importance of proper royal representation for the children. William's voice tightened slightly. She implied that Catherine's middle-class background made her ill-equipped to guide the children in royal protocols. Charles felt a cold anger beginning to build in his chest. He had worked hard over the years to ensure that Catherine felt welcomed and valued within the family, understanding how crucial her role would be not only as William's wife, but as a future queen consort. "That's completely unacceptable," Charles said firmly. "Catherine has shown nothing but grace and dedication to her royal duties, and she's been an exemplary mother." "What else has happened?" William's expression grew even more serious. "Last month, during the family dinner at Clarence's house, Camilla took Charlotte aside privately and began questioning her about her school friends, her activities, and her interests. When Charlotte mentioned that she enjoyed painting, Camilla told her that art was a lovely hobby, but that she should focus more on languages and deportment lessons if she wanted to be a proper princess." Charles felt his protective instincts flare. Charlotte was only 8 years old, and the idea of anyone pressuring her about her royal duties at such a young age went against everything he believed about allowing his grandchildren to have as normal a childhood as possible. Charlotte came home upset, William continued. She asked Catherine if she wasn't being a good enough princess because she liked painting more than French lessons. It took us several days to reassure her that she was perfect exactly as she is. William, I had no idea any of this was happening, Charles said, feeling a mixture of anger and guilt. How had he missed such significant overreach? There's more, father. William's voice grew heavier. 2 weeks ago, Camilla contacted George's school directly to inquire about his academic performance and to suggest additional tutoring in subjects she deemed important for his future role. She did this without consulting Catherine or me first. The school, naturally, contacted us for permission before sharing any information, which is how we discovered what had happened. Charles rubbed his temples, feeling a headache beginning to form. Each revelation painted a picture of inappropriate interference that he found difficult to reconcile with the woman he had married. But the incident that prompted this conversation happened last weekend, William said, his voice now carrying a note of barely controlled fury. Camilla approached Louis at the family gathering and began discussing with a 5-year-old child how he needed to start thinking about his responsibilities as a spare heir, how he should watch George carefully to learn proper behavior. Charles's protective instincts flared into full anger. Louis was barely out of toddlerhood, and the concept of burdening him with thoughts about royal duties at such an age was not only inappropriate but potentially harmful. She told a 5-year-old that being the spare was a difficult but important job and that he needed to be ready to step in if anything happened to George. William's voice cracked slightly with emotion. Louis came to Catherine in tears that night, asking if something bad was going to happen to George and if he would have to leave home to be king. Charles stood abruptly, pacing to the window as the full weight of what William was telling him sank in. His grandchildren were being subjected to inappropriate pressure and premature discussions about their royal duties by someone who should have been providing them with love and security. "Why didn't you come to me sooner?" Charles asked, turning back to face his son. William's expression softened slightly. "Because I hoped I could handle it diplomatically, Catherine, and I tried setting boundaries, having private conversations with Camilla about our preferences for raising the children. We assumed that clear communication would resolve the issues. But it didn't. No, it didn't. If anything, our attempts to establish boundaries seemed to make Camilla more determined to assert what she saw as her rightful role in the children's lives. She began making comments about how previous generations of royal children were raised with more discipline and proper understanding of their duties. Charles felt a chill as he recognized echoes of his own childhood in what William was describing. The pressure, the early indoctrination into duty at the expense of natural childhood development, the constant emphasis on protocol over personal well-being. "Father, I know this puts you in a difficult position," William said, his voice softening with understanding. "I know you love Camilla, and I'm not asking you to choose between your wife and your son. But I am asking you to protect your grandchildren from inappropriate interference in their upbringing." Charles returned to his chair, leaning forward to look directly at William. "You absolutely should have come to me sooner, but I understand why you try to handle it privately first. This is completely unacceptable, and I will address it immediately." "There's something else," William said hesitantly. Something that Catherine noticed, but wasn't sure whether to mention. Charles braced himself for another revelation. "What is it?" "Camilla has been keeping detailed notes about the children's behavior, their comments, their activities. Catherine discovered this accidentally when Camilla left her notebook open during a recent visit. The notes included assessments of their suitability for royal duties, recommendations for behavioral modifications, and even suggestions for limiting their interactions with Catherine's family. The final piece of information hit Charles like a physical blow. The idea that Camilla had been systematically documenting and analyzing his grandchildren's behavior as if they were subjects to be molded rather than children to be loved and nurtured was deeply disturbing. William, I need you to know that none of this represents my views or wishes for the children's upbringing, Charles said firmly. Catherine and you are their parents, and your decisions about their care and education should be respected absolutely. William nodded, and Charles could see some of the tension leaving his son's shoulders. I hope that would be your response, but I needed to hear it directly from you. What does Catherine think about all of this? Charles asked, concerned about his daughter-in-law's feelings and her position within the family. Catherine is hurt and frustrated, but she's been trying to handle it with grace, William replied. She doesn't want to create family drama, but she's becoming increasingly protective of the children. She started limiting their interactions with Camilla, which has led to additional tension. Charles understood Catherine's position perfectly. She was trying to balance her role as a royal family member with her primary responsibility as a mother protecting her children. I want to apologize to both of you for not being more aware of what was happening, Charles said. As head of this family, I should have noticed these issues and addressed them before they reached this point. William's expression softened considerably. Father, Camilla has been careful to present these interactions differently when you're present. She's been quite skilled at making her interference appear to be helpful involvement. This revelation troubled Charles even more than the others. It suggested a level of deliberate deception that he found difficult to reconcile with the woman he thought he knew and loved. What do you need from me going forward? Charles asked. I need your support in establishing clear boundaries regarding the children's upbringing, William replied. Catherine and I should have the final say in all decisions regarding their education, activities, public appearances, and personal development. We need Camilla to understand that her role is to be a loving step-grandmother, not an additional parent or royal instructor. Charles nodded emphatically. You have my complete support on that. What else? We need assurance that our private family decisions will be respected and that there won't be attempts to circumvent our authority by going directly to the children or their schools. William paused. And honestly, Father, we need to see genuine change in Camilla's behavior before we can feel comfortable with unsupervised interactions between her and the children. The weight of this final request settled heavily on Charles's shoulders. His son was essentially asking him to limit his wife's access to her step-grandchildren until she could prove that she would respect appropriate boundaries. That seems like a reasonable request, given what you've told me, Charles said after a moment. I will speak with Camilla immediately and make it clear that changes need to happen. William stood, and Charles could see relief washing over his son's features. Thank you, Father. I was worried that bringing this to your attention might create an impossible situation for you. Charles stood as well and approached his son. This time, when he embraced William, he felt his son relax into the hug. William, your children's well-being and your family's happiness will always be my priority. I'm grateful that you trusted me enough to bring these concerns to my attention. As they walked toward the door together, Charles felt the weight of the conversation he would need to have with Camilla pressing down on him. The revelations of the afternoon had painted a picture of behavior that was not only inappropriate, but potentially damaging to his relationship with his son and grandchildren. I'll call you after I've spoken with Camilla, Charles told William as they reached the entrance hall. We'll work together to make sure the situation is resolved properly. William nodded and turned to leave, then paused. Father, I want you to know that I hope this can all be resolved amicably. Despite everything, I don't want this to destroy your marriage or create permanent family divisions. Charles felt a surge of pride in his son's maturity and wisdom. Even while protecting his own family, William was showing concern for his father's well-being and happiness. As Charles watched William's car disappear down the driveway, he realized that the next few days would test not only his marriage, but his ability to balance his roles as husband, father, and grandfather. The conversation ahead with Camilla would be one of the most difficult of their marriage, but the protection of his grandchildren's well-being made it absolutely necessary. The truth was now clear, and there was no avoiding the confrontation that lay ahead. The drive back to Clarence House felt interminable to Charles, each mile bringing him closer to what he knew would be one of the most difficult conversations of his marriage. The revelations from his meeting with William had fundamentally altered his understanding of his family dynamics, and he found himself mentally rehearsing different approaches to confronting Camilla about her behavior. By the time he arrived home, evening shadows were lengthening across the grounds. Charles entered through the private entrance, hoping to have a few moments to collect his thoughts before facing his wife. However, Camilla was waiting for him in the entrance hall, her face a mask of carefully controlled anxiety. "How was your meeting with William?" she asked, her voice carrying a forced lightness that Charles now recognized as a warning sign. "We need to talk," Charles replied simply, removing his coat and hanging it on the nearby stand. Privately, Camilla's composure faltered slightly, but she nodded and followed him to his study. Charles closed the door behind them and moved to his desk, needing the physical barrier between them as he organized his thoughts. Camilla remained standing near the door, as if ready to flee if the conversation became too uncomfortable. "William shared some very concerning information with me today," Charles began, his voice calm, but carrying an unmistakable note of authority. "Information about your interactions with his family, particularly with the children." Camilla's face went pale, but she attempted to maintain her composure. "Charles, if William has concerns about family matters, perhaps we could all sit down together and discuss them civilly." "No, Camilla," Charles said firmly. "This is not a matter for group discussion. This is about your specific actions and decisions that have overstepped appropriate boundaries." Charles moved around his desk to face his wife directly. "Tell me about the photographer you arranged for George and Charlotte without consulting their parents." The color drained completely from Camilla's face, and Charles could see her mind racing as she tried to formulate a response. "I was trying to be helpful," she said finally. "The children need proper royal portraits, and I thought Catherine might appreciate not having to research photographers herself. By making arrangements without their permission and then suggesting Catherine was unqualified to handle such matters due to her background." Charles's voice carried a sharp edge that Camilla had rarely heard before. Camilla's attempt at denial died on her lips as she realized that William had provided Charles with specific details. "That's not how I intended it," she said weakly. "What about your conversation with Charlotte about her interests?" Charles pressed on, telling an 8-year-old that her love of painting was less important than deportment lessons. "Children need guidance about their future responsibilities," Camilla replied, but her voice lacked conviction. "I was trying to help her understand the importance of preparing for her role." Charles felt his anger building as he listened to his wife's attempt to justify behavior that he now saw clearly as inappropriate interference. "And Louis? You thought it appropriate to discuss the burdens of being a spare heir with a 5-year-old child?" Camilla's composure finally cracked completely. "Charles, you don't understand the pressures these children will face. Someone needs to prepare them properly for what's ahead." "Someone does need to prepare them," Charles said, his voice rising slightly. "Their parents. William and Catherine are more than capable of guiding their children's understanding of their royal roles at appropriate times and in appropriate ways." Camilla moved to one of the chairs facing his desk and sank into it, suddenly looking older and more fragile. "I was only trying to help. I know what it's like to be thrust into royal life without proper preparation. I thought I could spare them some of the difficulties I experienced." Charles studied his wife's face, seeing what appeared to be genuine distress mixed with defensiveness. "Camilla, I understand that your intentions may have been good, but your methods have been completely inappropriate. These are young children, not royal duties to be managed." "But, Charles, you were raised with clear expectations from an early age. You've often spoken about the importance of understanding duty and responsibility." Camilla's voice carried a note of desperation as she tried to justify her actions. "Yes, I was raised that way, and it was often harmful," Charles replied, his voice softening slightly as he thought about his own childhood experiences. I experienced the pressure and isolation that comes from being burdened with royal expectations too early. I don't want that for my grandchildren." This revelation seemed to surprise Camilla, who had perhaps assumed that Charles would support her more traditional approach to royal child-rearing. "I thought you would want them to be properly prepared. I want them to be happy, healthy children who gradually grow into an understanding of their roles," Charles said firmly. "I want them to have the childhood that I wish I had been allowed to have." Charles moved to the window, looking out at the garden where he had often played with George, Charlotte, and Louis during their visits. The memory of their laughter and uninhibited joy made the thought of anyone pressuring them with premature discussions of duty even more troubling. "William also mentioned that you contacted George's school directly without his parents' permission," Charles said, turning back to face Camilla. "That's completely unacceptable. You have no authority to make decisions about the children's education." Camilla's defensive posture returned. "I was concerned about his preparation for the responsibilities he'll inherit. I thought additional tutoring might be beneficial. That decision belongs to his parents, not to you," Charles said firmly. "Your role is to be a loving step-grandmother, not an additional parent or educational administrator." The silence stretched between them as Charles allowed the weight of his words to settle. He could see Camilla struggling with the implications of what he was saying, perhaps beginning to understand how her actions had been perceived by William and Catherine. "And then there's the matter of the notebook," Charles continued, his voice carrying a note of particular disapproval. Camilla's eyes widened with what appeared to be genuine surprise that this information had been discovered. "How did you—" she began, then stopped herself. "You've been keeping detailed records of the children's behavior and development, making assessments and recommendations as if they were subject to be analyzed rather than grandchildren to be loved," Charles said, his voice heavy with disappointment. "I was trying to be helpful," Camilla protested weakly. "I thought if I could identify areas where they might need additional support or guidance." "Camilla, these are children, not royal projects to be managed," Charles interrupted. "The fact that you would document and analyze their behavior in this way is deeply concerning." Charles returned to his desk and sat down, feeling the weight of the situation settling heavily on his shoulders. "I need you to understand something very clearly. William and Catherine are the parents of these children. They have the right and responsibility to make all decisions regarding their upbringing, education, and preparation for their future roles." Camilla nodded, but Charles could see that she was still struggling to fully accept the boundaries being set. "But surely as their step-grandmother, I should have some input." "Your input is welcome when it's requested," Charles cut her off firmly. "But you have no authority to make unilateral decisions about their lives, their education, or their royal duties. None whatsoever." The finality in Charles's voice seemed to penetrate Camilla's defensive walls, and he saw her shoulders slump in defeat. "I never intended to cause problems," she said quietly. "Intention and impact are two different things," Charles replied. "Your actions, regardless of their motivation, have caused significant distress to William, Catherine, and the children. That's what matters here." Charles leaned back in his chair, studying his wife's face carefully. "Camilla, I need to ask you directly. Do you understand why your behavior has been inappropriate?" Camilla was quiet for a long moment, and Charles could see her processing not just his words, but the entire situation. "I suppose I may have been too eager to help," she said finally. "Perhaps I overstepped some boundaries." "This isn't about being too eager," Charles said, his voice carrying a note of frustration at what he perceived as her continued minimization of the situation. "This is about fundamental respect for William and Catherine's role as parents and your understanding of your own role in this family." Charles stood and moved around his desk again, this time sitting in the chair next to Camilla rather than maintaining the formal distance. "Let me be very clear about what needs to happen going forward." Camilla turned to face him, and Charles could see both apprehension and resignation in her expression. "First, there will be no more direct contact with the children's schools or any other institutions involved in their care or education without explicit permission from William and Catherine, Charles said firmly. Camilla nodded reluctantly. Second, any suggestions or concerns you have regarding the children's upbringing or royal preparation will be discussed with their parents privately, not with the children directly. Charles, surely you don't expect me to treat them differently than I would any other grandchildren, Camilla protested. I expect you to treat them as children first and royal heirs second, Charles replied. Their parents will determine when and how they learn about their future responsibilities. Your job is to love them and support them, not to educate them about duty. Charles paused to let this sink in before continuing. Third, until you can demonstrate that you understand and respect these boundaries, your interactions with the children will be supervised by either William, Catherine, or myself. This final condition clearly shocked Camilla. You're restricting my access to the children? I'm ensuring their protection and well-being, Charles corrected. William and Catherine need to trust that their boundaries will be respected. Until that trust is rebuilt, supervision is necessary. Camilla's eyes filled with tears, and for the first time in the conversation, Charles saw what appeared to be genuine remorse rather than defensiveness. I never meant for things to go this far, she said softly. Charles reached over and took his wife's hand, his voice softening slightly. Camilla, I know you care about the children, and I believe your intentions came from a good place. But good intentions don't excuse harmful actions. What if I apologize to William and Catherine? Camilla asked hopefully. What if I promise to do better? Apologies are important, but they're not enough, Charles replied gently but firmly. William and Catherine need to see consistent changes in your behavior over time. Trust, once damaged, takes time and effort to rebuild. Camilla nodded slowly, finally, seeming to understand the gravity of the situation. How long do you think it will take? That depends entirely on your actions going forward, Charles said. If you can genuinely respect the boundaries we've discussed and demonstrate that you understand your appropriate role, then we can gradually rebuild the family relationships. Charles squeezed his wife's hand gently. Camilla, I love you, and I want this family to work. But my primary responsibility is to protect my children and grandchildren. Their well-being comes first always. I understand, Camilla said, though her voice carried a note of sadness. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right. Charles studied her face, looking for signs of genuine understanding versus mere compliance. I need you to call William tomorrow and apologize sincerely for your overreach. Not excuses, not justifications, just a genuine acknowledgement of how your actions affected his family. Camilla nodded. And Catherine? Yes, Catherine as well. She deserves a direct apology for the disrespect you've shown to her role as a mother and her capabilities as a future queen consort. The conversation continued for another hour, with Charles outlining specific expectations for Camilla's future behavior and ensuring that she understood the seriousness of the situation. By the time they finished, both were emotionally exhausted, but Charles felt confident that his message had been clearly communicated. As they prepared for bed that night, the atmosphere between them remained strained but not hostile. Charles had made his position clear, and Camilla seemed to genuinely understand the changes she needed to make. The next morning, Charles called William to update him on the conversation and confirmed that immediate changes would be implemented. William expressed relief and gratitude for his father's support and handling of the situation. Over the following weeks, Camilla did indeed apologize to both William and Catherine, and she began the slow process of rebuilding trust through consistent, respectful behavior. The supervised visits with the children were initially awkward, but gradually became more natural as everyone adjusted to the new boundaries. Charles found himself watching his family interactions more carefully, ensuring that the lessons learned from this experience would prevent similar problems in the future. The crisis had ultimately strengthened his relationship with William and clarified his priorities as both a father and grandfather. Months later, As Charles watched his grandchildren playing in the garden at Highgrove, he reflected on how the difficult conversation with William had ultimately protected not just his relationship with his son, but the emotional well-being of three young children who deserved to grow up surrounded by love and respect rather than pressure and inappropriate expectations. The hand he had extended to William had indeed uncovered what Camilla had tried to conceal, but it had also opened a path toward a healthier, more authentic family dynamic built on proper boundaries and mutual respect.